This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day. And that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I am joined by a writer and critic, Barry Forshaw, who has written about British horror movies, he's written about crime movies, and he's also written about books, crime novels particularly. I think I initially had an interaction with you on Facebook, Barry, because I was starting to read George Simenon novels, which I'd never read before.
Yes, he was, the last book I did was on Simenon, which was interesting. And I had to watch all of the Simenon films, of which there are many, and quite a few of them without English subs. So I had to test my extremely inadequate French just to get through them.
Wow, I was going to say, I mean, the books, they're a heck of a number as well. It's like well over 100, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he's amazingly prolific. One year he produced 25 novels in a single year, as well as having a very active, shall we say, a very active social life. He was still able to turn out 25 books. Not bad, is it?
What was he putting in that pipe?
Who knows?
In introducing you, what I get the feeling of is that there's a kind of mix of interests here with film noir, with crime film, with gothic film and horror movies, but also books. It very much creates a Venn diagram, which I see as very recognizable with my taste. How did yours develop?
I think it's the same as you, John, and I'd make the point that the real cineast, which of course is you and me, love cinema. So we're going to like Antonioni's La Ventura, we're going to like The Hammer Dracula, we're going to like Get Carter, Terrence Malick, you name it. If it's a good cinema, we'll respond to it, will we not? And you may have written something about Terrence Malick, I seem to remember.
Look, I'm trying to keep it under wraps. I'm not talking about it too much. I'm not promoting it at all.
Of course not.
Let's talk a little bit about how you got into specifically writing about films and books. What was your sort of career path? Because we both share our ancestry is in the north. Our geographical sort of origin story is in the north.
Well, it is the north where it starts for me. I've still got, in the room to my left, 5 very tatty ring-bound exercise books in which I've written all the films that I saw in the 60s, reviews. Some of them amazingly intelligent and articulate, some of them toe-curlingly awful, particularly in social attitudes. But then I'd never met, for instance, anyone who was gay when I was living in Liverpool. But then I would go into the Liverpool Echo once I started to write, and I would take in handwritten text, which the editor was very kind and would have them typed up for me, until one day he summoned me into his office and said, if you want to be a writer, Barry, why don't you get a typewriter? So that was how it started. Liverpool Echo and then 2 London papers. So
it came down from Cumbria to Liverpool was my first big city experience.
Well, it's interesting. The Liverpool Echo, when you read it and when I wrote for it, was, I don't want to be too churlish, but it was a real newspaper then. And like so many local papers, my local paper in London has just become a rag which just lists the latest crime and robberies and assaults on pensioners, and there are no arts pages anymore. So the great newspaper that was the Liverpool Echo is not what it was
Well, yeah, I mean, I even remember in Barrow in Furness where you had the Evening Mail and the Advertiser, and there were columns where you would see what the local music scene was about and what was going on in the town, and it had people writing for it, and it would even have book reviews and things like that written by local people. So I'm beginning to sound League of Gentlemanly now, local book reviews by local people.
Well, I'd done a lot on Italian cinema. If you know Liverpool, you know, of course, that there is the ferry across the Mersey to get to Wallasey. And there was a cinema in Wallasey called Continental. And all these foreign films like L'Avventura and L'Anedenia, Marienbad, that one had heard about, these iconic foreign movies that you couldn't see in Liverpool, you could get the ferry, which I did as a 12-year-old boy, to a different city. Can you imagine it now, a 12-year-old boy getting a ferry to a different city? And it seemed perfectly safe at the time. So I'd written a lot about Italian cinema, not liking it any more than, say, British or American cinema, but it was able to be the first book which was on Italian cinema, which is, of course, something you know a lot about, having lived so long in Italy.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, we'll have to have you on. I'm trying to revive the Cinema Italia podcast as well. So I'd like to, once I've got time, I'm definitely going to have that, another season of that.
Just so long as you don't criticize my Italian accent, John.
No, I don't. It gets to the stage. My problem is when I speak Italian, everybody says, my wife and my family all say, stop putting on that voice. And it's like, well, what voice? And it's like,
It's far worse than me, because I've done a lot on Nordic crime TV and films. And there I have a tactic. I can turn to my wife, who's a translator for Italian pronunciation. So when I'm doing something on Danish or Swedish or whatever, Scandinavian cinema, I have a trick, which is a series of contacts at the various embassies who I know well. So I'll ring them up and say, right, this is what I have to talk about. How do we pronounce that? And they will sometimes say to me, like, for instance, Ingmar Bergman, they'll say, you don't want to pronounce it correctly because nobody in England will know who you're talking about. If you say Bjurman, it's got to be Bergman. So you have to anglicize. You have to anglicize certain words, don't you?
I was told by a Dutch friend it's Paul Verhoeven, and then I'll drop it into conversation. I'll say, of course, Showgirls by it's probably Verhoeven's, and they'll be like, "Who? What are you talking about? Who are you talking about?"
But at least you've told them the film, so that's if they know their film, they say, "Oh yes, I know who he's talking about."
Moving on to this, I've read your book on British Gothic cinema, and it again intersects with so many things which I'm interested in, because I came from a literary background. I was studying this period. I was concentrated on Percy Shelley rather than Mary Shelley, but of course you can't read that period without going into the Gothic quite deeply. And I was kind of interested in the way, there's an interview you have with Kim Newman, one of the appendices of the book, as you interview several people, and he makes a distinction. He says, the Gothic is really Anne Radcliffe and that early 19th century strata of people, Mary Shelley, all those people. And then there's the late Edwardian sort of science fiction-y people who are more, that's where he sort of sees himself as sitting. And I started to think about that in terms of the British cinematic Gothic. We're more, it feels to me that we're more in that direction than we are early 19th century. Is that accurate, do you think?
Yes, it is a good point. It's interesting, though, that whenever you talk about the Gothic, one kind of get out of jail card for people when the entire genre is criticized is to talk about the literary antecedents, which can get you only so far. You have to say that the phenomenon of recognizing Edgar Allan Poe as a great American writer is relatively recent. I mean, in terms of millennia. Now he's regarded as one of the great writers, but for a long time, for instance, only the French looked at Poe and said, here is a major writer. And we have to say that the response to Mary Shelley, and it's different when you come to someone like Coleridge, who is definitely a Gothic writer and writes about vampires, but he's seen primarily as a poet. So when you're trying to defend the genre, which I've done many times over the years on radio and in various things, I will usually drop in a few Gothic names, as you say, both from the earlier and the later periods, to give it a legitimacy.
I always think it's interesting as well that these writers, I mean, I think this specifically of Poe and Lovecraft, and I'm going to probably get, maybe you want to take a swing at me, but I'm not entirely convinced they're great writers as such. I love reading them, I love, Lovecraft especially has great weaknesses as a writer but it's almost, I mean, I love pulp science fiction, I love pulp crime. The pulpiness is kind of part of the point.
Yes, except that you've just, as much as I like Lovecraft and Poe, you just mentioned a pulp writer and a poet. If you look at the ending, look at the last 4 or 5 lines of any Poe story, such as The Fall of the House of Usher, and I'm going to misquote it, something like the dark tarn closed silently over the House of Usher, or the last line of The Mask of the Red Death. The Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. There's a poet. Lovecraft, however, is just a very good, or is he a good pulp writer? He's the archetypal pulp horror writer, and as such, he's fine. Although many people find him unreadable today.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get mixed up in the sort of like the various politics and
the anti-Semitism, for instance.
Yes, quite. I mean, I think that's evident for everyone to see. But it's almost like I like his ideas. I mean, I really do enjoy the pleasure of the text, the pleasure of sitting down and reading him. I really enjoy reading his stories, no doubt about it. But it's also like you're not sort of like appreciating the texture of the prose. You're enjoying the sensational element of it and the atmosphere that's derived. Yes. And yeah, I don't know, maybe latterly I'm beginning to actually appreciate maybe more that, hang on a minute, having said all this, but maybe that is good writing when it comes down to it.
It could be said, except the problem for the cinema in terms of Lovecraft, Poe lends himself very well to the cinema because premature burials, corpses returning from the dead, you name it, are very cinematic. Lovecraft deliberately, and he's very easy to parody when he describes some unspeakable horror, because he doesn't describe this unspeakable horror. And that works quite well on the page, but the cinema's never quite sorted out how to film him, whereas Poe has a lot of excellent films made of his work over the years. But in terms of the British horror writers, I think you could say that the Gothic horror is a British creation, with a few foreigners who are allowed in at the back door.
In your book, it feels like there's very much a sort of central section which is sort of Hammer, and then the pre-Hammers and the post-Hammers, and that Hammer itself sort of rises from the grave towards the end as well. But where would you see the beginning of Gothic cinema in Britain?
Well, the irony is that it was something that we certainly did not like in this country. We invented the H certificate, the H for horror certificate. And basically, watch committees, the government wanted horror to go away. It was a disreputable form, and films like Frankenstein, which were tremendous successes, Dracula, they were a slight embarrassment. And in fact, of course, this was simultaneously happening in America, where they did their best to actually extirpate the entire genre. But horror, like the creatures that stalk in it, has a way of coming back from the dead, and it always does. And you mentioned Hammer. Well, Hammer, of course, is the thing that you, as an Englishman living in Italy, can feel proud of. Hammer is a cottage industry that did so well. It was disposed of in its day as disgusting. The famous remarks about Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, the only thing to do with this is to flush it down the nearest sewer, were the kind of things that was said about Hammer. Now Hammer seems this kind of classical, perfectly formed entity. Certainly the earlier films are better than the later films. Beautifully made, beautifully shot, with production design that looks like it was cost a lot more than actually did cost, with a conclave of actors like Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. It now seems this rather quaint, rather perfect British art form that we can be proud of retrospectively.
I think it's a really important point that you make about the actors as well. There's this sort of host of excellent sort of coming from theatre, excellent actors who turn up at the studios and really bring their A game. There's no sense that Peter Cushing or Christopher Lee are sort of slumming it. They're absolutely they're totally serious in intent. Yes. There's no winking to the audience.
Well, it's interesting that much as I like Vincent Price, the broad wing to the audience is there almost throughout. And it takes a British director, Michael Reeves, and much dispute between the two of them to get his best performance in Witchfinder General. where Michael Reeves keeps saying to Vincent, I don't want the winking performance that you don't take horror seriously. In fact, when you look at Vincent Price, who I know we're talking about British horror cinema, but he's kind of a British import. He makes a lot of the films over here. He's at his best when he does play it straight in the early Edgar Allan Poe films with Roger Corman and obviously Witchfinder General. But the British actors, John, as you said, did play it seriously. And I interviewed a lot of actors, Richard Pascoe, who in the evening would be at the RSC in Coriolanus. During the day, were filming The Gorgon, and they treated them both as work and did not condescend to and did not give less of themselves in this horror stuff, which is why it still works so well. I'm afraid parody to some degree is the death of real horror. The films like The Abominable Dr. Phibes are entertaining, but they are parodies of horror.
One of the things as a kid, when I first came across Hammer, it feels to me very much like I loved the set dressing. I loved the furniture. You know, I love there's a set design. There's there's a use of that color cinematography that it is. You know, I mean, referred to Coleman earlier on that he has also in the Poe adaptations, but in the Hammer films, it feels. I mean, color has a capital C to it.
Yes.
I mean,
well, in a way, you talk about the two things you just mentioned. You could say are the product of two men. Jack Asher, who shot a lot of the great Hammer films, is one of the great cinematographers. We look at people like Otto Heller, and they are obviously great, and John Alton for Anthony Mann's crime films. But Jack Asher was in their company, and particularly you talked about the set design and the color. The production designer, Bernard Robinson, was possibly the best because he worked with really minimal resources. He'd be shifting things around to create, the entrance to Dracula's castle or whatever on the most minimal of resources, whereas the great Hollywood production designers had money. Hammer didn't really have money. Everything was done on the cheap, which makes it all the more impressive, doesn't it?
One thing that you mentioned in the book as well is that, and I thought this was really interesting, and I actually went back and rewatched the movie, The Curse of Frankenstein, because you're talking about how scary it was at the time, and how later on Peter Cushing will say things like, oh, well, modern horror movies, they're just about, these terrible, horrible things happening, and they use these cheap tricks. And you're sort of saying, well, actually, if you go back to Curse of Frankenstein, it was genuinely horrifying at the time, and people were genuinely horrified. And it's kind of a little bit difficult, having had decades of Eli Roth and such, to sort of re-find what was so horrifying about something like Curse of Frankenstein.
Yeah, as well as where the monster played by Christopher Lee is shot in the face. Christopher Lee clamps his hand to his face, and there's a blood squid, which is, by today's standards, fairly modest. That was very strong stuff back in the late 50s, early 60s. Ditto Dracula. And the main difference, I suppose, in terms of the British horror is that when Bela Lugosi plays Dracula and creates the part for the cinema, it's almost without sex. He was something of a sex symbol in his younger days in Hungary, where he was a good-looking young man. By then, he's paunchy and middle-aged. And Bela Lugosi's Dracula has no sex. Christopher Lee is sex on a stick. And almost immediately, he was horrified and shocked, so he claims, to receive women's underwear sent to him. This monster that he created had a sexual charge. And that, I think, is possibly why the Hammer films started to upset the censors so much, because Hammer identified this link between sex and horror.
Yeah, there's all the diaphanous sort of nightgowns that the Barbara Shelley and Ingrid Pitt end up wearing.
But more than the diaphanous nightgowns, which obviously, and with Barbara Shelley and the Ingrid Pitt's cleavage, which are treated in a loving way, it's the response of Dracula's victims, which are clearly orgasmic. And I think Terence Fisher tries to disingenuously say that they were not aiming for that, and people are reading that in. Just look at the very first, Melissa Stribling in the first Dracula. Her response to being vampirized is not horror, is not fear, it's sexual arousal. And Hammer knew perfectly well that that's because what is vampirism but a metaphor for sex? What else is it?
Yeah, it's right there. It's on the tin, isn't it? It's what makes the novel and the play that was massively successful off the back of it. So easy to transport into cinema,
Yes.
in a sense. But about that transportation into cinema, so Hammer has a deal with Universal to sort of use their horror properties.
Yes, and of course they had this strange, very strange rule that they could not reproduce things. So Christopher Lee's Frankenstein monster could not look like Boris Karloff. It couldn't have the square forehead and the bolts in the neck.
Mm.
So as Christopher Lee said, we and the makeup man made him look like a traffic accident. That's the phrase they used. I remember as a boy, because I was too young to see that in the cinema when it was out, obviously. But the face looked like the most horrific thing we'd ever seen. It truly was genuinely horrific. Whereas by then, Carlos Frankenstein monster had become cozy. It was before the Addams Family and sections where it's parodied, the monsters and so forth. So Frankenstein is now kind of a jolly friend, as actually to a degree he was in James Whale's film. We have to remember that James Whale presented the monster as a sympathetic character. Christopher Lee does that less, but nevertheless makes him a victim. If he kills people, it's not because he's a force of evil, though there is a line about, in both films, about the wrong brain being used, which is kind of muddies the water slightly. Is the monster a homicidal monster, or is it just somebody who's badly done to? But the very fact that you and I are talking about that now shows the resonances of these films and the Gothic strain after all these years.
Yeah, Young Frankenstein, where he has the name Abby Normal. It's a name on the jar.
The thing is, it is the horror films, because they're so distinctive and their tropes lend themselves to parody. There's almost not a single great horror trope that's not been parodied endlessly. So it's harder and harder. As you say, someone like Eli Roth comes along, modern, and in more recent years, in the 70s, there was the director Peter Walker, who had to make those horror films like Frightmare very extreme for their day, with cannibalism and visual evidence of cannibalism, to bring that shock factor back that the Hammer films had and that the Universal original films had.
Yeah, I watched Frightmare again on the recommendation of your book, because I'd never seen it before, so I watched it last night, and just before Liverpool beat Newcastle 2-0.
Two horrors.
Oh, are you an Evertonian then?
I'm the one person from Liverpool who actually doesn't follow football. You have met that person, John.
Okay. Well, that's I didn't think he existed, but now I see.
I am that man.
And Frightmare is I mean, this is 1974, right? This is
Yes.
This is a kind of quite serious. I mean, it reminded me of an Italian horror movie.
Yes. What's interesting about that, it's the way with horror films, I suppose it's true of many genres and idioms, it's the coming together of a certain degree of talent. So with the original Frankenstein, we have an expat gay British director, James Whale. We have an expat British actor, Boris Karloff. We have all the accoutrements of the Hollywood studios, and it produces that mix. With the Pete Walker films, they are usually written by a writer who's a friend of mine, David McGillivray. And he's interested in doing something interesting. He's interested in talking about British society while delivering exactly what's required for a horror audience. Peter Walker, the director, claims that he was more interested in just making money. That's why he made the films. And he knew that the market by the 70s required strong meat, literally. But somehow that concatenation of those two elements produced this lovely little series of very British horror films, which were as British in the way as the Hammer films were, despite the fact that they're set in Transylvania. They couldn't be more British.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and everybody speaks in clipped accents, and
you know. Or when they go into an inn, they have North Country accents. That's always the problem. It's like the problem with Chekhov. If you see a Chekhov play, how do you distinguish between the aristocratic characters and the servants? You have to give them northern accents. And you're thinking, hang on, this is Russia. This is St. Petersburg, or whatever. But you have to find an equivalence, and horror films do that. So you will have the lovely character actor Michael Ripple always playing the innkeeper who warns people not to go to Dracula's castle. And he has to do it in a northern accent.
I mean, that happens in literary translation as well. I read a lot of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy in those almost constant Bennett translations, and whenever it's the working class, they become Cockneys. So they're like, okay, Gov, and it doesn't.
Because, as you say, I've done a lot of books about crime as well, and the translation of Italian writers you have the problem if people speak in regional accents or Sicilian accents or whatever. How do you translate that? And in some cases, they've rendered it into Cockney, which just is wrong.
Yeah.
You have to find something which isn't Cockney, which isn't Northern England, but doesn't sound like the Italian equivalent of RP.
It's a marked type of speech, but at the same time, just it can't be a one-for-one transposition to something else. Absolutely. Frightmare, one of the things that, I mean, I love the look of it. I love the humor of it. I love the tagline, An Ordinary Tale of Country Folk, taken from The Archers, I think. Yes. You point out.
Not one that would work for American audiences, that tagline.
True enough. And I kind of like the teenage, that Clockwork Orange teenage panic sort of feel to it, you know, going into the nightclub with the biker gang, and that seems to be in the background of those 70s films as well, this sort of growing moral panic about the youth.
Yes. Well, you can't, I mean, it's the cross-fertilization of genres that you get. So obviously you just mentioned that. So you've got Clockwork Orange, which kind of changes cinema in a way. And that's something that's going to happen. For instance, the novel by Thomas Harris, Silence of the Lambs, and the other novels in that sequence, are they crime novels or are they horror novels? The answer is they're both. And by the time he comes along, and the subsequent films, which have people being trepanned and their brains being eaten while they're alive, if that isn't a horror film trope, what is? And so that gave horror films a bit of a problem. When Hammer was around, there was no one else. There was Amicus Films, which is another British cottage industry, although it was run by two Americans, one of whom I knew, Milton Subotsky. But that was totally British, full of British character actors. And they could, for instance, call on Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing and top British actors because they would be paid for 2 or 3 days of work. They could do it in between other things. They would then be used because they had marquee clout, their name on the film, even if they're only in it for 20 minutes, would still sell the movie. And that's the kind of British thing. It's more than America. America didn't have too much of that. They had Vincent Price, but Vincent Price was working over here a lot of the time.
Well, let's get a sort of historical perspective on this. Well, at the beginning, you have Hammer, and the Hammer, you have quite a few Hammer movies before they really established their style, right?
Yes.
What's the first sort of Hammer movie that you would point to if someone wanted to do a chronological, but not a complete viewing of their films? What would be the one you would point to and say, okay, you should start there? That's where Hammer really gets it right.
Well, there are a lot of the early films which are currently being reissued by a revivified Hammer. Hammer has risen from the dead yet again, and there will be new films apparently, but they're also dusting off all of these earlier films. The earlier crime films had things like Stolen Face, which had horror elements, but it's when they buy... Hammer had made a specialty of remaking TV successes. And many people forget that one of Hammer's greatest successes was the appalling On the Buses, which is just as bad as the TV show, but it was one of their biggest hits. They were a company that remade TV properties. So they found Nigel Neal's The Quatermass Experiment. And although it's a science fiction film, obviously it's overtly a science fiction film, it's full of horror elements. And I can remember that when, again, I was at school, it was considered to be the most horrific thing. It was the horror element that what people took from Nigel Neal, even though he's always a science fiction writer, even when he's writing about the supernatural, like The Stone Tape, it's got a scientific rationale. So the answer to your question, John, is The Quatermass Experiment. That does so well that shortly after the idea of making Curse of Frankenstein comes and plundering not so much British Gothic literature, but the Universal Films catalogue.
Yeah, which themselves have taken Gothic literature and run with it. And so then you have, in the light of the success of the Hammer movies, you have several studios starting up and creating films that when you reference them in the book, or when you just talk about them in the book, I was sort of thinking, oh, hang on a minute, I thought that was a Hammer film. I didn't realize that was a sort of competitor dressed up in Hammer-like clothes.
Well, Amicus, who I mentioned, Hammer were not too upset by them, despite the fact clearly they were aiming to get their market, because they felt that A, the market was big enough to sustain both, B, they were the market leaders, Hammer, nobody was going to touch them. But C, Amicus because it had even less money than Hammer, generally did contemporary subjects. So they were cheaper to make. Their main cost was in the acting talent that they had, but they would get American writers like Robert Bloch to write to do versions of their own stories. So they were very successful, but in their own way. Although they wanted, in fact, Milton Subotsky, who was the creative force behind the company, was the man who proposed Frankenstein to Hammer Films. People don't know this, and it proves your point about the two intermingling, John, that Milton Subotsky proposed Frankenstein to Hammer. They didn't buy his treatment. They didn't like it. They wrote their own treatment by the writer Jimmy Sangster, which was a source of deep resentment for Milton Subotsky, but that catapulted him into making his own company. There are also companies like Anglo Amalgamated who made some excellent movies, and there are excellent British horror films which have nothing to do with Hammer. The best supernatural horror film ever made in Britain is Night of the Demon, Jacques Tourneur, which was made by an American producer, a French but America adjacent director, Jacques Tourneur, American star but with British supporting talent. And then shortly after, another film, Night of the Eagle, which again is British, and is possibly the second best supernatural film made. You could argue that the three best are Night of the Demon, Night of the Eagle, and The Innocents. That's our defining trilogy of British supernatural black and white movies.
Excellent, yeah. And Night of the Demon goes back to our H.P. Lovecraft conversation about not showing or showing the indescribable horror in the monster which is pursuing. Reading your description of that of the film and it reminded me of last episode's conversation with Christopher Frayling, and we were talking about Nosferatu, and he made this really interesting point that Murnau and his collaborators actually believed in the occult, and so were very had this that imbues the film with a sort of a creepiness that otherwise other iterations of the film don't have, of that story of Nosferatu don't have. And I was thinking of sort of Night of the Demon and Dennis Wheatley in The Devil Rides Out, and this whole strand of occultism. And we had a similar thing in Britain, didn't we? We had writers like Colin Wilson who were describing it, but at the same time you never quite knew how much they believed in it or didn't.
I'm sure the writer Peter James, who's a friend, won't mind me telling this story. At a meal for one of his books, he suddenly put us all on the spot, and there were a lot of writers in the room and journalists like myself. He went around the table and said to us all, "I would like you all to give me an example of a supernatural thing that's happened to you." As it went around the table, everyone came up with something. It was getting closer and closer to me, and I thought, what do? I don't want to be the one person who's going to say, much as I love the supernatural, I don't believe in it, and I faked it. I faked a supernatural story. And I wonder if that's often the case when people claim to know these things. Peter James was a horror writer. Colin Wilson seemed genuinely to believe in these things. A lot of people do. I think it's like when you and I, John, watch Euripides or Sophocles, watch Greek tragedy, we don't have to believe in the existence of Zeus and the gods, do we? We just accept that it's a convention. And when you watch supernatural horror films, you accept that there is a netherworld out there, even if you don't believe in it.
Well, I find that when I love writing fiction, and I find myself always writing sort of magical narratives, and that magic in real life I don't believe in at all. I just wonder if at that dinner everybody was making that same calculation.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, John, because I did ask two people I knew who were skeptics like me, and they said exactly what I said. We were not going to be the people who say, sorry, it's all bunk. We love the movies and we love the books, but we don't believe it. Nobody wants, and I think that's about peer pressure as much as anything else. Rather than belief in the supernatural, it's peer pressure not to be the odd man out.
Yeah, exactly. Not to be the party pooper.
But party pooper, indeed.
It's that story. We're sitting around and telling stories. So let's just keep up the fiction, so to speak.
Yes. Well, it helped that Peter James would always claim that he lives in a haunted house. Not that he's a horror writer anymore. He now considers himself a crime writer. But it's quite good for, and of course, Conan Doyle, who wrote, Hello, Sherlock Holmes doesn't deal with the supernatural, but he did. And Sherlock Holmes believed in this and was taken in, Conan Doyle was taken in by that amazingly, arrogantly ludicrous picture of two little girls with superimposed fairies. He believed it. And you think, how could a man as hard-headed as him believe in that? People are prepared to believe in the supernatural, it would seem.
Yeah, yeah. I remember they made a film about that as well. Peter O'Toole was Conan Doyle, and
Yes,
Harvey Keitel was Harry Houdini.
yes.
Great casting, not a great film.
You mentioned Houdini. He's an interesting figure because he made the most of suggesting there was something supernatural about him. But he was a trickster, and one of the great tricksters of the age. But he knew it helped his image to suggest that something non-natural was happening when he was underwater in a box with chains around it. He had some kind of supernatural ability. With one bound, he was free.
Yeah, exactly. And also, H.P. Lovecraft ghost wrote several stories under Harry Houdini's name.
Yes, indeed, yes.
So as we go from Amicus and Hammer into the 70s, and you get these films more like Deathline, for instance, is another example, the Witchfinders General, you get a sort of more, the X certificate has come in.
Yes.
Boundaries are being pushed and new genres are being made. I mean, Witchfinders General, I think, is often seen as the beginning of folk horror as a genre in itself.
It is. And then part of the reason is, and I can remember this from its first showings, Hammer Films presented a slightly roseate is the wrong word, but an unreal view of the past. Everything was beautiful and colourful and striking. It didn't really look like the past. Transylvania was always Britain anyway. It was always Bray Studios. So it looked British. Rather like, I was thinking of this with Polanski's film of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Doesn't ever look like Britain. It looks like France. The whole thing looks like France. But it's fine. But when Witchfinder General came along, as you correctly say, John, it's the beginning of folk horror. And part of the reason is because Michael Reeves tries to make it look like the real era. It's not, nobody's wearing colourful costumes. Everyone looks a bit grubby and everything is grubby. And from then on, we have shortly after films like Blood on Satan's Claw, which takes that even further. So it does look like the real Cromwellian England, if you like. And now folk horror reigns supreme. But you could also argue that none of these, like Witchfinder General, and even back to the Karloff films, it's always a cross-fertilization from Britain and America. There's very rarely something which is just totally British. The nearest to that would be some of the Hammer films, which were made with British money, although Universal was prepared to stump up money when it realized how successful this was. But their old properties, which were just shown on TV, were suddenly making money again in new clothes. It's generally, and you can't be prissy about this, we need American talent. We need Dana Andrews over here finding out about that demon. The British couldn't do it. We needed an American.
How did Hammer work in the States? Did they gain any traction there?
Yes, they did. Well, they were always in close communication with the Universal Studios, Carreras and co. And they said it was quite amusing how originally they were told that they had to do something very different from the Universal. I don't know why the Universal felt this, because they had nothing to gain other than TV sales. There were not new cinema showings. But then Universal, as I said, realized just what a gold mine they had in this little British company who was making these. And then they allowed them to do anything. So there were no restrictions anymore. The Frankenstein monster, by the time of later films, looks like Karloff. He's got a square forehead, the belts in the neck, because they could then get away with it later. So there is definitely cross-fertilization. Universal were more than happy to, enjoy the shekels that were coming their way until, of course, The Exorcist happens. And when The Exorcist happens, it's the death knell for the British period horror movie.
All of a sudden it goes contemporary, and I mean, you've already had perhaps what do you call a foreshadowing of that with Rosemary's Baby and Polanski. What about the critical reputation of Hammer? At what point does Hammer, it's hugely popular. People are buying tickets. Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, massively famous for their roles in the Hammer movies. But at what point do people start thinking this is something we should actually look at? I mean, you writing a book on it, for instance. How does that stand in the critical reception of Hammer, if you like?
Well, they were never quite respectable. I suppose the nearest they got to respectability was when they got the Queen's Award for Industry. And that was a recognition by the establishment that, okay, this stuff is fine. Christopher Lee, when I interviewed him, I didn't interview Peter Cushing, but both would prefer the film, terror film, to horror films, which at the time was fine, but now would be just as tricky, wouldn't it? Because the word terror means terrorism. It's got that connotation. And they would say they were, as you said, I think you said earlier, they were kind of fairy stories. And in a way they are. Of course they're fairy stories. People turning into bats. Come on. It's not the real world, is it? And they were right to stress that they were not real. And they didn't like kind of more gruesome horror. It's interesting that Hammer had a separate strand, which we haven't talked about, which is the films made in emulation of Psycho. So they make a film like Taste of Fear. It's black and white, still widescreen, so it's very handsome looking, and that was directed by the alcoholic but very talented Seth Holt. And there's a whole series of harmless psychological thrillers, which are closer to the real world in this fact they often deal with homicidal killers. Although it's interesting that, like Italian gialli films, often the films appear to be about homicidal killers. They're usually about money, mammon. People are usually being killed for money in most of them. It's a trick, because maybe that's more interesting than a psychopath.
I guess you've got the sort of the Return of the Prodigal Son with Alfred Hitchcock coming back to London to make Frenzy, as part of not exactly part of that cycle, but going into that landscape of films that have been made.
Well, it's interesting. Frenzy is a very significant film in a lot of ways, because Hitchcock has always tried to push the envelope in America. He's always battling the censor. Psycho, for instance, first film to ever show a toilet being flushed.
That's my favourite fact of that film. I love that fact.
I mean, come on. And that was shocking in the day, and he had to promote that in many ways. By the time he comes back to make Frenzy in Britain, things have changed. The world has changed into Hitchcock's vision of the world. So we can have nudity, which he'd always wanted to do, and so he can use a double for animacy in the nude scene. Particularly, it's the killing of a woman in the film, which is done as a rape and a killing in the kind of grim, grueling detail that Hitchcock he touched before, but never like this. It was considered to be a very dark film, and in a way, it did show that the era of the Hammer film had passed. Hitchcock coming back to make his last British film is using the language that was then current in the cinema, which is much more uncompromising than Hammer film ever did.
Yeah, and there is something about that banality of evil that you get there. I mean, you have the famous shot going down the stairs and then out into the street and life just going on while a murder is taking place. But I always remember finding that such an unattractive film, not just because of the cruelty, but just because it seemed almost willfully ugly.
Well, in many ways it isn't, because John Finch, who's the putative hero, is an unsympathetic hero. Earlier, it's interesting, that's consistent with our greatest, well, is he our greatest director? Him or Michael Powell? Let's put both there. He often was clearly more interested in the villain than the hero. So in Strangers on a Train, Robert Walker's gay killer is much more interesting than Farley Granger. But he doesn't make Farley Granger unattractive. He just allows him to be a bit dull. Doesn't matter. And again, Rebecca, Mrs. Danvers, is the most interesting character. Again, the gay villain. It's interesting. Hitchcock's not very progressive in his thinking when it comes to gay characters. But by the time of Frenzy, he does present, as you say, it's a fairly grim view. It's also it's a view of London at a tipping point. When Hitchcock makes Frenzy, which is set in Covent Garden is already finished as a fruit market. He has to recreate it because it's gone, literally almost overnight. And people were still around watching him filming it who remembered Covent Garden. So for Americans who were looking at it, they said, well, that's of course Covent Garden. That's what it's like still. Now Covent Garden is just a tourist trap. with people selling trinkets and so forth, and it already was starting that way. So you could say that film signals the end of one era and the beginning of another.
And I mean, other films that you mentioned which have had a huge impact, and especially an impact maybe many years after they were released. Although you're quite interesting on Wicker Man, that it showed in a double bill with Don't Look Now, and you report that quite a lot of people were saying, "Oh, you've got to stay for the Wicker Man. It's as good as, if not better than, Don't Look Now."
Yes, that's quite interesting. The days of double features, John, seems a million years ago, but that was the talk of the day, and I remember it. Critical response: please stay for the second feature, or in fact, ignore the second feature. It's quite good, Don't Look Now, Nicholas Roeg, but the second feature is better and more interesting, and that wouldn't happen anymore because second features don't happen anymore. That's a film which is so often imitated. As someone who writes, I'm the FT's crown critic, and I keep encountering the same plot again and again and again. The same thing happens in the cinema. You say, oh, here we go again. It's the Wicker Man.
Right. It becomes like an archetypal plot. It goes from being the really original to being everybody's doing it now.
And the problem is, when you try to remake it, as Nicolas Cage did, you see how tricky it is to get it right. And it's interesting, the film does a variety of interesting things. It has Christopher Lee in, so he's there for marquee value, but he's not playing a typical Christopher Lee part. He's not sinister. He's this amiable, likable monster. And so it's not a typical Christopher Lee part. So it's playing with but as an actor, he's kind of unique in that respect. His image was played around with by many directors. He's in at least 3 films in which he's a red herring. You will see Christopher Lee as a doctor, and I won't tell the film in case people haven't seen it. You say, he's the killer. That's it. It's Christopher Lee. Come on. He isn't. And that device was used several times, even in one film, again, which I won't name, where he's actually dead, but we're allowed to think that the film he's still alive committing the murders. I don't know of any other actor, apart possibly from Boris Karloff, who played around with their image to that degree. Because Karloff actually, towards the end, liked to play sympathetic characters rather than monsters, or both. In a film called The Haunted Strangler, he is both the monster and the sympathetic character trying to find the monster, not knowing it himself.
And of course, you've got him in Targets as sort of playing with his own image as a film star, yes, a horror film star for the Bogdanovich.
But that goes back to what I said earlier about the American. It's Bogdanovich's film. He writes something knowingly because he's a film man, Bogdanovich. He knows everything about the history of the cinema. And he knows he will attract Karloff by making him a sympathetic character and making someone lamenting the fact that the kind of horror that he traded in is gone. Now the real horror is an anonymous boy on a water tower shooting it. Look how prescient that film was. Well, it was already based on something that had happened, but that's the new horror. And it's more tricky to make old-fashioned horror anything other than the kind of something in aspic. And really, it is in aspic. And when we watch Hammer films, we're watching something which is preserved.
That's really interesting. That idea that horror also it contains within itself a sort of nostalgia for itself. Or wasn't it great when Jack the Ripper was killing people?
Yes. But in a way, that's interesting because Jack the Ripper was a standard trope of the horror film. There are umpteen movies which have him as a character. Obviously, you have to come up with there's only one given in any film about Jack the Ripper that he can't be caught. Because we know he wasn't. In fact, oddly enough, there's a Jesus Franco film with Klaus Kinski where he is caught. And you find yourself thinking, that was a bit lazy. Come on, he never came to trial, so he can't be taken off by the police as he is at the end of that. He has to fall into the Thames or whatever. But Jack the Ripper is now a contentious issue, and a lot of feminist critics have said we shouldn't be lionizing this figure who killed so many women, even to the degree that there are books which suggest that many of his victims were not prostitutes, as we have thought for so many years, and that's how they're always played in the movies. So horror is slightly more tricky these days in a time when we have to be careful not to tread on toes.
Hallie Rubenhold, yes. If any listeners are interested, that was a fascinating read. And yes, she argued that the definition of the women, the victim blaming of the women as as sex workers was mainly due to the fact that that's how a lot of working class women were just assumed to be, and also very hazy definition of what sex worker would be in those days, because
Yes.
if you're destitute and you need a place to stay.
Well, it's also the fact that it still had a resonance when the Yorkshire Ripper was plying his trade. A policeman famously said something to the effect that he is now killing women who are not prostitutes, as if they kind of put themselves in the firing line by their job. But now it's respectable women being killed. That really was a turning point when everyone reacted with horror at that. Said, "Come on, he's killing women. Let's not draw a distinction between them." So, but it is showing that horror has always had this edge, that it's never been respectable, and maybe to work in its own terms, it needs to be unrespectable. It needs to have the edge of something transgressive.
But that goes with something that we were talking about at the very beginning of the conversation. That I like the pulpiness of Lovecraft. I don't necessarily want to see him spruced up, and I don't want to have an anthology of literary essays, critical essays about him. I just want to like him as he is. A friend of mine referred once to the gentrification of horror, that there's this idea that we're going to go in and we're going to redo horror, but we're going to spruce it up with some intellectual ideas and make it very respectable to like. Hammer feels like it's a million miles away from that, and all the better for it.
Well, of many interviews over the years I've done about horror, I've had to do, to a degree, what I've just done with you, John, is to give it the respectable credentials, shore up its credentials by saying, look, Coleridge wrote about a vampire, and I'm finding horror in Dickens. There's plenty of horror in Dickens. Dickens knew exactly how to chill an audience, and he would use horror tropes. He's our most respectable writer, is he not? So I'm not sure I agree with you. I quite like, shall we say, adducing all of that stuff to give a respectability to horror. Basically, to deal with the people who say horror is beneath consideration. It appeals to the lowest common denominator of human nature. I've got to have an answer for those guys and women.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I understand that. I guess I mean I love the whole panorama of it. And I can enjoy The Witch, and I can enjoy Midsummer, and films which have come along and have given sort of are obviously very thoughtful films that are really about something other than just the situation of the protagonist. They're really going a little bit for an extra mile in their thought. But I also like the schlocky common denominator stuff as well.
Well, I agree, and I'm a great fan of the Italian horror film and the Italian giallo, which are the glossy thrillers set among upper middle class types who are being murdered in somewhere like London, but it's actually Rome, funnily enough. Although there'll be a few pickup shots of Piccadilly Circus to try to persuade you you're in London. And often those films, Italian horror films, are schlocky. They're often unrealistic. And even the best directors like Mario Bava and Dario Argento are not the most rigorous storytellers or creators of narrative. That's not why you go to them. You go to them to a degree because there is a schlockiness, and there's also a degree of almost fine art in the way these films look. They're often very beautiful, the films of Argento and Mario Bava. But interestingly, Argento famously quoted a Poe line, which is not acceptable anymore. There's something poetic in the death of a beautiful woman. That line is fine, but it's just not. It's not sayable in the 21st century.
Right, absolutely. Where do you see Gothic today? I mean, you've already sort of hinted maybe at how sometimes these stories will repeat themselves, and we had last 10 years. It seems like you can't leave the house without being hit by a folk horror film. But where do you see the most interesting sort of strands of the British Gothic horror film?
I think you've, to a degree, put your finger on it when you mentioned things like Midsummer and currently The Substance. Those are films which deliver the horror tropes, but they also have to be about something. They're both about something. In a way, it's kind of like it gives the audience carte blanche to say, I went to this horror film, but I wasn't just going for the blood and guts. I was going because this is about the treatment of women in society, or whether primitive religions still have a hold over people and so forth. I'm not sure that the horror film came back to a degree for Hammer when the last iteration of Hammer, there's a new owner now, had a hit with The Woman in Black, but they did have a very bankable star in that. They had Harry Potter in the film. They had a property which had already been...
that would, sorry for laughing, but that would annoy him so much.
Wouldn't it just? Possibly why I said it. But it was already a well-known property. So Nigel Neal had done a wonderful TV version, which genuinely still raises the hackles on the neck when you see it. It had played at a London theatre for donkey's years, so it was a saleable property. Everyone knew that the Woman in Black was going to give you chills and was going to be a good Jamesian, Wellesian horror story. I think after that last iteration of Hammer struggled to do something else as big. They had this massive hit, which was kind of a false dawn. Now, the new Hammer, under new ownership, is going to try, it says, to do that again. But do they need all those elements I've just described to make a hit? It can't just come out of the blue. It has to have a variety of reasons why it's successful. For instance, in the West End recently, a lot of Hollywood stars have been doing Shakespeare and Ibsen and Euripides to very mixed results. Some of them have been well reviewed and very successful. Currently, Much Ado About Nothing has Hayley Atwell in, and obviously it's doing well. But you have to have now, to sell something, a variety of elements that come together and get bums on seats. Not so easy.
Yeah. I wonder if Blumhouse is a model that people in Britain and the new owners of Hammer should be thinking about, because that idea of let's make really low to middle budget movies, which of course in a British context would have to be lower than the 5 million that I think is the ceiling that Blumhouse puts on a lot of its pictures. But I mean, in a sense, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think Jason Blumhouse really is onto something, because ultimately you go and see a horror film for the twist and the twist or the key concept, and those things are actually very cheap. The idea of it follows, it's just something that follows you, and that's a really cheap concept, but as soon as you have it, it's you can run with it.
The trouble is that when you get a concept that takes off, like the found footage phenomenon, almost immediately it's run into the ground by hundreds of found footage films. And I'm as guilty as anyone. I would go on watching each new iteration of the found footage film until I thought, oh no, I've seen this too often. The first few times you're invited to look at a living room in which somebody is sitting but not moving, and you find yourself studying every inch of the frame where something is going to appear, and you are genuinely unsettled by that. But you can't do that too often. You get bored. You get bored looking at that still frame, thinking, oh, well, there's something nasty going to appear out of that doorway, which is not new. If you go back to John Carpenter's Halloween, he cleverly would place characters to the right of the frame with an open doorway on the extreme left. The audience would be looking nervously at that doorway. And the trouble is, audiences become au fait quite quickly with the way they are being worked, the way they're being manipulated. So there are new... Blumhouse, as you mentioned, is a good example. New things come along, but then they quickly get run into the ground.
I mean, I was there. I was there when Blair Witch happened. I recently rewatched Blair Witch, having not seen it for years and years and years, and I'm happy to report that film is perfect.
Yes, it does work very well. They don't have any missteps, do they? Which is the problem with those films don't require the Christopher Lees or the Peter Cushings. You don't know who the actors are. You've never seen them before. So they're quite successful. I suppose The Substance currently has the selling point is a major Hollywood star has been in the shadow for a while and has now come back with a bang with this film. So there's the selling point of that film. A good horror film, which also has this one element. The Blair Witch Project had to only have its concept and the reputation of how well made it was to get people to go and see it. Certainly wasn't the actors.
Oh, yeah. They kind of disappeared afterwards as well.
Didn't they just? Yes. So I wonder if the answer to your question is a British horror is going to be something out of left field at regular intervals. I can't see that we'll ever have you mentioned folk horror. Recently, there's a Severin, the American company, has done a folk horror box, which has umpteen films. The reason they are folk horror films is because they've been defined as such. That's what they're called. And they're in a box set called folk horror. One of them is a film called City of the Dead, which is a British horror film made by Milton Subotsky. And it's set in a not very convincing America. But it could be argued it is folk horror. And some of the other films are definitely folk horror. But people will tire of folk horror very soon, I predict.
Well, I'm a little bit tired of it already, I must admit. If I need to see one more Shining-inspired aerial shot of a car winding down a road into the woods, I think that's horrifying in itself. Listen, Barry, I need to ask you one final question, and that is, I need to ask you for a recommended book for our readers. For our listeners, sorry, but obviously,
listeners.
My listeners and readers is synonymous for this podcast.
Of course they are, yes. Well, you've got very good writers on the genre. Jonathan Rigby has written English Gothic, and Kim Newman has written a lot about it. David Perry was the man who, in Heritage of Horror, first started to take a lot of these films seriously. Hammer had already started to be taken seriously, but I'm cheating him because I'm giving you several books. But he also started to take seriously the kind of trilogy, Circus of Horrors, Peeping Tom, and Horrors of the Wet Museum. There was an Anglo-amalgamated trilogy, which he described as Sadian films. And they're colourful and not highly thought of in the day, but now seen much more affectionately. But I'd go for a book that I'd spend 50% disagreeing with, and that's Carlos Claren's Horror Movies, which was a defining book. I find myself amazed that I mention it because he doesn't like Hammer films. He sees Hammer. He say, "I know. Can you believe it, John? Can you believe it?" He says, "So they're cheaply made, they're repetitive, they're crude, and so forth." He simply does not get Hammer. But you don't have to read books on film, and you and I read a lot of books on film, do we not?
We do.
To look at them all. One of my favorite writers on film is Penelope Houston in contemporary cinema. She's famous for her attacks on Hitchcock, Hammer films, horror films generally. She says, "Oh, why are these young critics praising all this stuff? It isn't as good as L'Aventura or Battleship Potemkin and so forth." I still, because she's such an elegant writer, I still like reading her. And Carlos Claren's Horror Movies is so well written, I can forgive him for not getting Hammer.
Yeah, there are some people like Dilys Powell as well. I grew up reading Dilys Powell, or Anthony Lane. I used to read a lot when he wrote for the New Yorker. I think he still does, and I would almost predict how I would disagree with him. I would think, "Oh, here he goes. I know he'll hate this film that I've loved, but he'll hate it in a way that it will be right." You know, I might disagree with him, but I can see why he doesn't like the film. It's perfectly described.
Well, it's a writer like Robin Wood, who is one of the great British film critics, was also one of the first to spot in American cinema and British cinema that something good, something subversive, something off the wall was happening in genre cinema when other critics were writing it off as rubbish. And he had this strange thing that cinema had to be somehow ameliorating, and it had to make you a better person from film. So he praised Ingmar Bergman because he felt that the films were positive about human existence. I'm a great Bergman fan, but I don't agree with him. I think Bergman has a pretty dark view of human nature and the artist and so forth. But Robin Wood's very good on the horror film. So I'd add, as an adjunct to Carlos Claren's, anything you can find by Robin Wood on the horror film.
I always think Bergman's... It's funny how some of our most respected filmmakers get a pass when it comes to the old... I mean, I'm not a supporter of the cancellation game at all. Let me just make that clear. But it's just like, does anybody remember that Bergman was kind of like a Nazi when he was young? That he was kind of quite expressive of Nazi sympathies? And it's like Lars von Trier, yes, we'll cancel him. Yes. Bergman, no.
But it's possibly because it's not known. And you could also argue that Bergman did plenty of mea culpas and said, "Look, I was a young man."
Yes, that's true.
We were all taking it on board then. And of course, I was unbelievably stupid to say that. So, and also, I think the main thing, John, is that nobody knows it.
Yeah.
It's people like you and I remember that thing about Bergman. But I think we're going to mention that Bergman, of course, made horror movies. So you've got
True, The
The
Magician.
Seventh Seal is pretty horrific and was remade as Last House on the Left.
Yeah,
Hour of the Wolf by Bergman is a horror film.
absolutely.
Specifically a horror film, and it's an extremely good one. And I knew his son-in-law, Henning Mankell, the Scandinavian crime writer, Swedish crime writer, who would go with his father-in-law to the private cinema and watch films. And I said to Henning, so would you sit there watching von Sternberg and Eisenstein? He said, oh, God, no. He liked horror films. He liked crime films. Bergman relaxed by watching popular movies like Ocean's 11. So we shouldn't think of him as in his ivory tower, because he wasn't.
None of these filmmakers are. And if I can refer to Terrence Malick, who somebody has written a book about him.
Somebody wrote a book.
I'm not sure.
It will come to me who that writer is at some point.
Yeah. One of his favourite films is Zoolander.
Yes.
that's. I think filmmakers don't like watching films that look like their own films. I think they like to go and see different things that they would never be thinking of doing, because ultimately they go to the same cinema we do, for the same reasons we do, which is like not to be at work.
Well, it's interesting. It can cut both ways, because I did know Charlie Watts of the Rolling Stones, and he liked classical music. He would talk to me about classical music, and I said, so shouldn't you be just listening to heavy rock? He said, oh, no, I don't listen to that rubbish. I don't want to hear that. I want to hear a good jazz drummer, or I want to hear Stravinsky or Bartok. And so that wouldn't have gone down too well with his fans.
Absolutely.
I mean, you want things in different genres, do you not? You and I both. Come on, we like books about film, so it would be no good as only reading about art films, art house movies, would it? Or Hitchcock. We want to read about it all.
Yeah, exactly. I'm vociferous appetites, Catholic tastes. That's what we're about on this podcast. Well, listen, Barry, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. As I knew it would be when I read your book. I just thought, this guy, he's got, we've just got such a similar sensibility and approach.
Thank you, John.